So what had happened was there were a lot of prospective initiates waiting there, and so Mukunda and Guru Das, I believe, arranged for one or two to go and stay with Prabhupada at his house for 1 or 2 days. So that was a wonderful experience for me because my initiation was in Prabhupada's house. It was a one-on-one, you see. So when it was my time to go, I was told to bring something which is called dakshin. I brought him some sandalwood oil, some cloth, and some incense. And I was very, very timid and very shy in those days, and very anxious and very nervous. So I went up there with all these things, and I knocked on the door. Kirtananda was with Prabhupada and Hayagriva, and I believe Upendra, but I'm not quite sure if he was there. And I was very anxious to go in and see the Swami, and they had to calm me down and say, just a minute, the Swami will see in a little while. This is like this, very nervous. And so I sat there, and after a while, Swamiji, as we called him, called us in, Srila Prabhupada, called me in. And I didn't know how to act, what to do, what to bow down, how long to stay. And I offered him my respects. And he said to me, I remember the first thing he said was, oh, so you want to be initiated? And right away I was feeling condescending in my mind. Well, of course I do. Why else am I here, you see? I took a little offense by that, due to arrogance, false pride. But it dissipated very easily. And I said yes, and he asked me if I knew what the requirements were, and I told him the rules and regulations. And the thing that I noticed about Prabhupada was I was very attracted to his eyes. There was something very special. At that time, that's all I can understand. They were just glowing, and it was something about him that was very different. It really soothed me. So he said, all right, you can go now, and we'll call you back in a little while. I offered my obeisances, and I just stayed down. I didn't know how long to stay there. So I just stayed down there, and Prabhupada said, all right, you can get up now. And so I got up, and then I went out. And I don't recall exactly what I was doing, but we were sitting outside for a while. A little while later, I think it was Kirtananda called me, and he nudged me. He said, come in, the Swami wants to see you. So he called me in. Prabhupada was sitting on his bed. I sat on the floor. It was a very narrow room, maybe 4 or 5 feet wide and 8 or 9 long, approximately. I remember there was a picture that Jadharani had painted of, or somebody, Jagannath Puri, at one side of the bed, and one on this side of Prabhupada. I don't recall. It might have been his Guru Dev, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And he told me the basic rules and regulations, checked with me again if I knew them, and I told him. And then he chanted on my beads. And there was no fire sacrifice for my first initiation. And then he said, my name is Aniruddha. Aniruddha. I remember that's how Prabhupada said it. I remember that Dha. And I said, what does it mean? He said, it's the grandson of Krishna. I couldn't think of anything to say. I was very fidgety. So then he said, do you have any questions? And I was foolish. I couldn't think of anything intelligent to say. And I remember reading that one of the qualities of a devotee is that he's grave. So I said, what does grave mean? It's just a silly question. Prabhupada looked at me, but he just smiled and he told me what it meant, And then I left his association. Again, I offered my obeisances and went out. A while later, Prabhupada was calling me, but I had already forgotten my name. He was calling Aniruddha, but I didn't know who he was calling, so I was just sitting there. And there was probably Kirtananda who came nudging me, saying, the Swami is calling you, the Swami is calling you. So I went in, but I don't recall exactly what he said, at the time. I've heard this from a lot of my god brothers and sisters. We're so nervous and don't know how to act that we don't always remember the specifics, But the overall impression was overwhelming. Later on, it had such a great effect upon me, even just a short time later. But initially, I was bewildered. What I did remember, I spent 1 night and 2 days with Srila Prabhupada, is that the fact that his life was so perfectly organized, everything was at a certain time, He had his time for waking up, time for japa, time for bath, time for massage, time for the mail, a time to take prasadam. We took a walk at a certain time. This was so impressive to me. My life had been so disorganized for so many years, and I really was very attracted to that. I know I walked with Srila Prabhupada on the ocean in the morning, and we had kirtan. It was a little fast, and Prabhupada said a little slower, a little slower. And then I was going back on the bus and I was trying to think, well, I don't feel any different, you know. I'm still thinking that a spiritual master is something like magic, or you'll have to get some charge or something, you know. And I was riding thinking, well, you know, I expected to feel something different and I didn't. But as we were approaching the city, I felt such a surge of enthusiasm to be very serious, you know, that I wanted to be very strict with myself. I wanted to remain celibate, and I wanted to be brahmachari, and all the things Prabhupada was talking about, you know. And so I came back to the temple with this mood of enthusiasm, and they told me, you'll get over it. Because the San Francisco temple in those days was considered very, very loose compared to New York, which was very, very strict. You know, San Francisco was a different mood, and they were all wearing flowery clothes, and there wasn't such a strict following there. After some of the kirtans, the devotees would go off to the local coffee shop and have donuts and so forth, you know. So, but I was very attracted to what Prabhupada said. I wanted to be very serious in those days. I didn't know what type of show it was, so I mentioned to the producer that we had an album called the Happening Album. I gave him prospectus, and so they saw that. The interviewer, the first thing he said to Srila Prabhupada was, "Oh, Swami, I understand you have a record album. You must make a lot of money." And Prabhupada just smiled at him and said, "Yes, $1,000 a week." You know, so he was defeated immediately because he was trying to get an audience. There was several popular shows at that time. He thought this was just some strange cult or something or other. He could cut him apart. So the interview in the end went along like that, but afterwards the producer couldn't look us in the face because he saw how genuine Srila Prabhupada was, you see. And then, but the Les Crane show was wonderful. There, we get in there, and the beginning of the show was Prabhupada chanting Bandeham prayers. It went on, they allowed it to go on for a longer period than they planned, and then he chanted Hare Krishna, and they had beautiful visuals of him and so forth, and devotees. And then they interviewed him, asking him the general questions about sadhana and so forth and so on. Prabhupada made the audience his friend right away. He was a real gentleman. He spoke very kindly, and he smiled, and he said, "And I am such and such of age, and I even have my original teeth." So the audience loved him right away, you see, because they thought they were going to get this heavy thing, you know. But he let Mukunda do a lot of the speaking, because Mukunda was a cool, calm and cool-headed boy, and he made a good impression, you know, and he spoke the basic things about tilak and so forth and so on. And then the latter part of the show, they had this Youth for Christ group on, and they were very dogmatic, you know. Christ is the only way, and so forth and so on, you know. And so the audience didn't like them very much, actually. And even after the show, they were very much taken with Srila Prabhupada. In the parking lot, they came over to him and saw that he was a genuine person. This is the quality, you know, that Prabhupada had. He was not like any of those other bogus gurus. Prabhupada said that before I have come to the Western world, all these other yogis have been just speculating on the mental platform, you see. So certainly, and he was just a perfect Vaishnava, gentleman. So he never disturbed anybody. Then we had these college engagements. The UCLA was a fiasco. Nobody showed up. And Prabhupada gets to this place that I had arranged, you know, due to my inexperience. I didn't do it very properly, and we didn't have much Lakshmi to advertise. And so nobody is there. So Prabhupada looks at me and he says, "So, Aniruddha?" And I just was being very shy. I just felt like I was about this size, you know. I wanted to hide somewhere. And he said, "That is all right. Let us have kirtan." So we had kirtan, and then some Indian student saw that there was some kind of sadhu inside, and he came in to speak with Srila Prabhupada. And they were speaking in their local language, probably Bengali or whatever. And you could see he was a bit challenging, like you know, a smart, like the Brahmanas who are you know, impersonalists and so forth, intelligence and so forth. And there was a tone of argument there anyway. But when he spoke English, Srila Prabhupada said, "Tell me, young man, where are your Indian countrymen?" You see. And the young man was quite flustered. He didn't have an answer for that. And Prabhupada said very, very gravely, "I will tell you, they are lost." Hare Krishna. Incense at the Vedanta Society, which was at that time, their property was on where Hollywood and Vine intersect. You take Vine going up to the bottom of the hills, and they had an ashram about a quarter of the way up there. And it was a private place, nice property. And I go there to buy incense because they had the best incense at that time. And I mentioned that to Prabhupada. He said, "I want to go and see that place." So I took him there, and he walked around the property, and he didn't really, you know, he was very aloof from the whole thing. And then he said, "I would like to have an appointment with the Swami in charge here." Swami, his name was Swami Pravavananda. He, along with Christopher Isherwood, had written the Penguin edition of the Bhagavad-gita that many of us had been reading in those times. It was just verses with some, interpretation. And he was the head of this chapter of the Vedanta Society, which was of the Ramakrishna mission, founded by Vivekananda in the 1918 or 17, something like that. He came here. So I went down there and made the arrangements. We went down there. We went to Swami Prabhupada office, myself and some devotees, and we walk in, and this Swami is a gentleman wearing a business suit and neighbor jacket like that. Looked like a businessman. And they had a conversation, and you could see right away that there was a very strong, challenging mood. We didn't understand what was going on, but our feeling was it wasn't very enlivening. We were not enthused by the conversation. Prabhupada was all aglow. He was saying, "Oh, Chaitanya," and this man was saying, "No, no, Swami, Chaitanya, no, 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 no." So on the way back in the car, we were very quiet. There wasn't very much enthusiasm. We were just chanting. Everything was quiet. And then Prabhupada said, this Vedanta Society was introduced in America by Swami Vivekananda, who was preaching about Ramakrishna. He said, Ramakrishna was not very popular in India, but Swami Vivekananda, he came here. He was a very intellectual type, wearing a turban, and he spoke and he told everybody how great Ramakrishna was. And he attracted very scholarly, a lot of elderly people and so forth to get money, and he became famous. Then he went back to India, so anything that became famous in America, then the Indians would follow. So he became famous that way. But in India, Prabhupada said he wasn't really much of anything, He's just a concoction, really. And then he said, the Swami Vivekananda, he came here 50 years ago, and they have only now 7 centers. He didn't even say only, he said they have 7 centers. And then he just smiled and he said, and we too have 7 centers. So everybody said, Jai! And Prabhupada just lifted us up and made us understand how much this movement has power and is growing, which was always the way he did things like that. I just read a letter that Prabhupada had written from here to Janardhan in Montreal, where he said, just the other day we went to see Swami Prabhupada of the Vedanta Society, and Swami Vivekananda has preached that Ramakrishna is an incarnation of Lord Chaitanya. In his last life he was Lord Chaitanya, something like that, And he said, just see what kind of philosophy this is, that how could Krishna was preaching one thing and now he's preaching something else, In other words, you understand. So this is why this so-called Swami was getting very upset, because Prabhupada was saying these kind of things to him, So we understood. I was thinking at the time, due to my immaturity, that he was arguing about placing our books in their stores, but I understand they're all impersonalists. They would never put our books there. I had no idea what was going on. We took a walk with Srila Prabhupada on the pier at Venice Beach, and it was, just before sunrise. The sun was coming up, and there was a woman at the end of the pier fishing, and as we came closer, she got up and she said, "Oh, Swami," and she clasped her hands. She said, "Oh, Swami, I saw you the other night on the Les Crane show. It's so nice to meet you, And she was fishing, and that's all she said. And afterwards, Prabhupada said, just the fact that she gave respect to a saintly person, she will advance so much, One time we were riding on the freeway. I don't recall where we were going, but there was a sign here in LA that said Santa Cruz, a certain amount of miles, And Prabhupada said, "What is this Santa Cruz?" So I told him, my literal understanding of the translation in Spanish. It's a name for Lord Jesus. It means Saint of the Cross, just literally. He said, yes, in India there was a place called Santa Cruz also that was founded by some missionaries, he said. It comes from the word Shanta, which means saintly, he said. You can call me Shanta Bhaktivedanta. They seem so simple, but I'm visualizing Prabhupada, and it's just so ecstatic, to realize how he cultivated us in such simple little things, And yet he was implanting this this knowledge, this devotion of love that we gradually felt for him, which just completely changed our life, And so we're so grateful. Another time, Prabhupada at that time was trying to acquire a permanent visa. I don't know all the intricacies of the situation, but I know he had to see a doctor to get a doctor's health statement for whether it was a permanent one or a temporary one. And I had a friend who had a doctor, he recommended a doctor for me in Pasadena. It was La Crescenta. So we were driving Prabhupada to the doctor. I believe Subal was driving the car, and I think Gorsunda was there. I'm not quite sure. I might not have even been there, but I know the story, but I think I was. It's a little vague. And because this was a hippie car, it was an old Volkswagen that some hippie had donated who was favorable to the movement, but it had all these huge, colorful flowers painted on it, big, big daisies, like, you know, in different colors. So you could see it a mile away. So naturally, some policemen stopped us just for the fact that he knew something had to be wrong with it, just by the way it looked. So Subal had an outstanding number of traffic violations, and they immediately took him away. Prabhupada was there in the middle of the freeway. But of course, I think Gosunda was there, so he drove. But Prabhupada said, Krishna is telling us that we need a better car, you see. So that's a small little sideline.
One time I went...
Now, also at that particular time when Prabhupada first arrived, I got a call from New York City, from Life magazine. They were doing an article on the Swami circuit, they called it, because there was a beginning interest in these different groups of Swamis, you know, impersonal Swamis, and so forth and so on. They had gone to our 26 Second Avenue temple, but Prabhupada was in LA, they told him, so they called me. A freelance photographer called and said that, and reported that they wanted to see the Swami. So I arranged it with Srila Prabhupada. They came to the temple and they made it look a little nicer than it was by putting up some things. And I was sitting there while they interviewed Prabhupada. The reporter was there, and it was a woman reporter, Mataji, and a freelance photographer. And they asked Prabhupada some questions, but basically first he described the mission he was on, and they didn't write any of those things down. I was watching, which was very typical of the reporters in those days. Whenever Prabhupada spoke philosophy, they would gloss over, flip the page, not write it, but they wanted to know why we were wearing tilak and what was the bead bag and all that stuff, you know. And so I didn't realize, I thought, I was a little confused because I didn't know these things and that they would be like that. So I was anxious to see the article. There was not a word of what Prabhupada said in the article, but they did say, of all the groups that they mentioned, you can't get this Hare Krishna mantra out of your head. And they did mention something that Prabhupada said, that Lord Krishna, the Swami said Lord Krishna descended at such and such a time to this planet. And so the fact that he mentioned Lord Krishna, Prabhupada said, was wonderful. But what he did say really was that anybody who sees these pictures, who's sincere, will benefit from the pictures. He said, that is all right, they will see the pictures. And they had this wonderful picture of Prabhupada. But it was done with filters to make it more attractive. So that was very nice. In San Francisco, we went on many walks with Srila Prabhupada. One of his favorite places was Stowe Lake, which is a beautiful lake in the middle of Golden Gate Park. And actually, Prabhupada called it a garden because it's architecturally landscaped. You know, it isn't natural like Griffith Park in Los Angeles. And Stowe Lake is a beautiful lake, and we'd walk there with Prabhupada. In the morning, there would be the same woman that would come all the time with her dog. And Prabhupada would always just say, hello, good morning, how are you? You see, and she'd just smile, you know. He never said Hare Krishna. You know. So one morning, one of the disciples that were there, I forget who it was, one of my godbrothers, asked Prabhupada why. He said, Swamiji, why do you not say Hare Krishna to her? He said, probably, he said, she would not say Hare Krishna back. And this way she gets the benefit of giving respect to a saintly person. It's the same kind of thing as in Venice. The Dasya told me that the Swamiji prefers to be called Srila Prabhupada. See, I wasn't around when they had this discussion, you know, about how this would come about. So I heard it through Govinda Dasi, and it was a little disturbing to me because I was attached to that name. So on this morning walk with Srila Prabhupada, I went up to him and I said, Swamiji, I understand that you prefer to be called Prabhupada. And he said, where did you hear this? Who told you this? And then his mood changed. He said, actually, I do not prefer, but it is better. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada used to use eucalyptus twigs to clean his teeth. And we had to have a certain size. It had to be about the size of this finger, a little longer, you know, and a little green, you know, not too green, you know, just on the verge, and about maybe that long. And then we would cut them down, and then he would soak them overnight in water, and then bite them between his teeth, the tips, and then use the bristles as a toothbrush. So we took turns in getting these for Prabhupada. Here in Los Angeles, there were a lot of eucalyptus trees. I don't know if they still are, but they certainly were in those days. And I would go to MacArthur Park, which is on Wilshire Boulevard. I don't know if it's still there. And just about sunrise, and I would wear my hat. I don't think I had shaved up then. Maybe we were shaved up. And I had my bead bag and a huge knife. I'd never been there before. The devotees told me that's where they got them because it was quiet in the morning. Nobody was there, you know. So I parked my car just about the time that the sun came up, and I would cut down a large branch with a lot of tributaries just to pick out the right size, you know. And I'm sitting there on this bench with this knife cutting these trees, and all of a sudden the patrol car pulls up. You know, they're coming through the park, checking at certain hours. And this policeman comes up to me, typically, you know, kind of strutting like, you know, kind of arrogant like, and he just comes up to me and he says, well, what do you have there, young man? And I told him, I said, I'm cutting these down for my spiritual master. He uses these as toothbrush. And he said to me, have I been in a mental institution? What do you have in that bag there? You know, and I explained that to him. He said, I can arrest you, you know, for carrying that weapon in your hand. But he saw that he was just using his power. And he said, okay, you know. So I told this to Srila Prabhupada, and he said, well, did you ask him if he was crazy? So I took it as Prabhupada teaching me to be bold, you know. So we had very easy access to Srila Prabhupada in those days. Sometimes, you know, I was a little older than most of the devotees. I was 27, and I'd get an anxiety about things. They would take my things or whatever. So I'd go to see Srila Prabhupada, and many of my godbrothers experienced this in Prabhupada's presence. We'd be in such anxiety about this and that, and as soon as we came into Prabhupada's room, we understood right away that we should just chant Hare Krishna and everything would disappear. So we couldn't even approach Prabhupada with these questions. So one time I had the good fortune to be in there, or as Prabhupada would say, I created your good fortune, you know, which is actually the truth, you know. It was Prabhupada who created this good fortune for us to be there. I remember I was there, and I don't remember the actual reason I went to see him. It might have been one of those times when I was anxiety. So I just sat down and chanted, you see. It was a large room. It was just myself and Srila Prabhupada. He was sitting over there, and I was sitting here. And he said to me, and I sat on the floor, and he said to me, take a pillow because sitting on the floor creates hemorrhoids. Just like that. Everything's so practical, you see. And then I started to chant, and I was very engrossed in my chanting, and I closed my eyes, which is common for me to do, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me that maybe I was taking up too much of Srila Prabhupada's time. So I opened up my eyes and I said, I should go, Srila Prabhupada. And he said, no, that is all right, you can stay. So I asked him, it might have been another time, or it might have been this time, but I asked him, I said, is it really true, Srila Prabhupada, that we can speak and talk to Krishna just like I'm speaking and seeing you, talking to you? And he looked at me and he said, yes. And that's all that I needed to know, you see. It's very clear that, just like that, a matter of fact, absolutely. So that was a wonderful experience. We all had our doubts, you know, we were practicing, but still, you know, we weren't fully knowledgeable of this, even to this day, you know, so certainly that was a wonderful thing. It was very reassuring. So we had this wonderful Rath Yatra in San Francisco, and I had such an ecstatic experience. And so I wrote Prabhupada a letter about, you know, what I was feeling, and his answer was that, yes, Krishna consciousness is experienced like electric energy. He said the atheistic people may say that after all this was just a festival and there was a cart made out of wood, but they don't understand that the Krishna consciousness energy can be experienced through any element. It's all just Krishna's energies, he said. So now you have to spread this electric Krishna consciousness energy through your country, that there are many, many festivals like Rath Yatra, not just this one, but Krishna has multi-pastimeous activities. You can gradually introduce them little by little into your center, you see. So now you can experience what the masses in large can feel, you see, that you're experiencing just a small percentage of this amount. So that was a very enlivening letter. So also going back to San Francisco, when I was there at the time, there's a devotee here in Los Angeles now. At that time he was in San Francisco. And it's all right to mention his name because this story has been circulated. And his name is Makun Lal, and his brother, his name is Narayan. And they were very sincere devotees. They came in the early days of San Francisco. And Prabhupada said that they were very nice but a little eccentric. See, so Makun Lal, I told him this the other day, and he said, it is all right because it's already been said, you know. And he's not like that so much anymore, you know. But they were very sincere. And they were hippies. They had very long hair and wore very typical clothes of those days. Somewhat, to me, it was the impression of them was they were a bit Shakespearean when they spoke, you know. Hare Krishna, like that, you see. Makun Lal still has that. So it used to irritate me terribly when Makun Lal would chant. He'd say, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, like that. And I would get very disturbed during the kirtans. So we had arranged this engagement that Makun Lal did in the YWCA in Berkeley. And we went along in the car with Srila Prabhupada. I drove him and drove him back. I believe Makun Lal was in the car going but not coming back. And we get there, and all was very nice, and all of a sudden, who's leading the kirtan but Mukundalal? So I must have shown, very obviously, my distaste. I think I might have even gotten out of the room, as a matter of fact. He was not very tolerant and didn't understand the right thing. So driving Prabhupada home in the car, and we're driving alone, and he looks at me and he said, Aniruddha, this Mukundalal, he sings very nicely, don't you think? So I had to say, Jai, Prabhupada. But then I understood, gradually, now that Trinad api suni chena tarapi sahishnuna amanina manadena kirtaniya sadari. In that mode, you can preach and chant incessantly, and Prabhupada knew exactly how to see everybody and utilize their service, even though there were some qualities that were not very nice. He never found fault, he only found the good. And he always used to say to us, it's very easy to be critical, but to find the good is rare, you see. And that was not my quality, but I'm beginning to understand that when I reflect on these things now. How magnificently, that is the real way to preach. That is the real way to not disturb anybody. And Prabhupada was a perfect Vaishnava. And one of the qualities of a Vaishnava is that he's a perfect gentleman, a pure Vaishnava. And he doesn't disturb anybody's mind. And he's able to just see that and take it out. That's why we all wanted to serve him. See, why we have difficulty with some people who don't have that quality. It's very rare to achieve that in fullness. But we can achieve it if we understand that, by that example. Srila temple, there's a nice story in relationship to Vishnu Jana Swami. He since has left his body. And he was a wonderful devotee. And he sang beautifully. Prabhupada used to say by his singing alone, he can go back to the spiritual world. But he was very expert in instruments. He liked to play elaborately on the harmonium and play the tambura. And he made up his own melodies quite a bit, So he was a little bit embarrassed to go in front of Prabhupada with his own melodies, but he wanted to be recognized. So in the Lasiyanaga temple, Prabhupada had a room that he used adjoining the main temple room, just while he was coming there, not to stay, just to stay for some privacy. You can go in from the front of the temple and also go into the temple room. So Vishnu Jana would sit outside in the temple room, and he would play these melodies in front of Prabhupada with the harmonium very elaborately. And Prabhupada came out and said, what is wrong with the melodies I have given you? I say that in context to today, since the movement has grown so much and we have so many different melodies, but I'm so fond of the original melodies. Although, Prabhupada was very broad-minded also. He knew that we were attracting all kinds of varieties of people. But he did say in those days, very specifically, when Vishnu Jana Maharaj started to have these road companies and they would play with guitars and a lot of music, he'd say, this is very good to attract people coming on the periphery, but the devotees shouldn't get that attached to it, you see. But it's very common now to some places for them to play all these songs very commonly, So whatever brings them into Krishna consciousness is all right, because Prabhupada taught us to be broad-minded. We have to be careful not to go too far, compromise too much.
I remember.
Then I had been in Hawaii for a number of years. I came there in 1973, and Ambarish Prabhu had bought this beautiful home for Srila Prabhupada that he wanted to have for him to translate without being disturbed, and so Prabhupada came to Hawaii. First he came to, the time before that, he came to a temple in Moana Loa Valley on a street called Ala Aloha Loop. It's a little bit out of the main part of town, in a residential area, very difficult to get to, nobody could come by very easily. It was just a place we found, There was a few temples there, but this was the second one. Govinda Dasi and Gauradas had started that temple. And then this was the next one that Sudama at the time was a Maharaj, was in charge of. And Prabhupada came there. I remember he came there because I was there at that time. He cooked the feast even, and it was just unbelievable. And then I remember specifically we were having Guru Puj. And this has never left me all these years. We were chanting Shri Guru Charana Padma, and I opened my eyes and looked, and Prabhupada is saying, we should enter into the meaning of this, you see. I didn't quite grasp what that meant, but that has stayed with me all these years, And it really is very, very deep meaning. I'm beginning to just get a little flash of that, That this is very important, that when you really mean that you want to be serious to follow Srila Prabhupada, really mean it, then I'm finding that the process is just really beginning for me with that attitude for the first time. And entering to the meaning really means to understand what Prabhupada is really doing. I don't know if you want to put this on the tape or not, But understanding what it really means, that Prabhupada, he's telling us all these things, but they're having the real meaning of it, that the spiritual master is, his lotus feet are the only way that you can achieve pure devotional service. And you have to be burning with that desire. Prabhupada used to say in all his lectures, you have to be very anxious for this and develop this, but we heard it, but we couldn't quite understand what that really meant, So this is not so easy, but when you change your heart and you really become serious, then you can enter into the meaning of these things and feel it with great emotion, and really feel a great reciprocation from Srila Prabhupada. It comes from changing, really meaning what you say. I'm going to follow you strictly. Sometimes we say, I'll try, you see, because we're not always ready to do that in our life. We have a lot of things, It takes a while. Everybody has a different way to go, Everybody goes at a certain pace, But sooner or later, that's the goal. So if you can achieve that, it's very nice, Prabhupada would like that, So that's very important. I would stay back, and one particular morning, I was sitting on the steps going up to the second floor, which led to Prabhupada's apartment, and some devotee had stayed back to guard Prabhupada's quarters. And I was talking to him, telling him probably some stories about Prabhupada. And just when I turned around, there was Prabhupada coming up the stairs, you see. So I had to offer my respects, of course. And he said, "Oh, Aniruddha, how are you?" Just so general questions, So I had to be honest. I couldn't say I'm fine, So I said, "How can I be, Prabhupada? I'm not living in the temple." So he looked at me very seriously. He got very grave. He said, "So?" That's all he had to say, He understood exactly what he meant. You're speaking like this, but why you're not acting this way? Hare Krishna. And he went upstairs. So when Prabhupada was leaving, we all went to the airport to see him off. And in the Hawaii airport at that time, the gate was separated from the main thoroughfare of the terminal with just a glass partition. There was an entry, but they had some glass you can look through. So I was staying on the outside of the glass partition. Everybody went inside and was sitting around Prabhupada, and I was staying away, But I wanted to, but at the same time I was listening to my mind. So Bhumya came to the gate, to the glass, and said to me, he said, "Prabhupada wants to see you." So again, my heart started to really pound, boom, 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 boom. And so I went inside, and very shyly, he had Sudama get up and have me sit next to him. I later on learned that Satsarup Maharaj Goswami, who was traveling with Prabhupada, had mentioned, "Oh, there's Aniruddha, Prabhupada, you remember him?" He said, "Yes, tell him to come in." So I sat next to him, and he just looked at me and he said, "Oh, how have you been? You've been with your father?" Something like general. So, immediately the mind is thinking, well, why is he asking me about that, But I understand now that Prabhupada was revealing to me that he knew that most of my problems dealt from the fact that I had a very bad relationship with my father as a karmi, and that that's one of the reasons I couldn't relate to anybody, and why I couldn't speak, why I was so shy, And so I really lament now, because what I was feeling was that I wanted to say, "No, Prabhupada, you are my father," you see. But I couldn't say that, so I said, "No, Srila Prabhupada, ever since I have had anything to do with Krishna consciousness, my parents don't want to have anything to do with me." And we both just smiled. Prabhupada's face just lit up, and I came alive, I was so morose, all that before, but my whole life came back to me again at that moment. My spiritual life, I felt so enlivened. I realized how morose I was. And it was just a very wonderful experience. Then he turned to everybody and said, in LA, because the devotees were in awe, thinking that I was having this communication with Prabhupada. And they were transcendently envious, which is beautiful, He said, we all want to have some association with Prabhupada. But I was oblivious that I was just focusing on Srila Prabhupada, and him and me, but we were the only ones there. But when I turned around, I noticed this, and that they were looking that way. And he said, in LA, Aniruddha was the beginning, you see. So right away, I felt very ashamed of myself. I knew that it was leading up to giving me some instruction. Because I knew that Prabhupada knew my heart, and he knew how to bring us out, that I understood that I was just covered over, but that I had a certain attitude that would get clear fairly easily, And just gross bodily gratification. I wasn't really envious of him in any way. So I felt responsible to help that temple because of that, because the temple at the time was having difficulty, and I had a lot of experience in that in LA. So that was a reminder to me that I could help in that respect, you see. And then it was announced that it was time for his plane to leave. So Prabhupada was walking to the gate. And as he's walking towards the gate, he turns around, but he doesn't look at me, but I could see from the corner of my eye that he was looking at me like that. You know, you can just see his eyes move. He said, Aniruddha, you take charge of Sankirtan. And here was the instruction I was fearing. And I said, take charge, Prabhupada, because I wasn't even chanting my rounds or anything. And he said, yes, Hare Krishna. And he just went on the plane. So, what can you do? Of course, I'm sure Prabhupada knew that I wouldn't do it right away, you know. But these things were there and have never left me. And whether or not he knew I wasn't going to do it then, I really believe that Prabhupada knew that this would happen, because I'm ready to do these things now. And this is the importance. These things have been going in my mind over and over for years. I've just never acted on them. So I feel very determined now to fulfill all these things that Prabhupada said. In one letter he said to me, you can do tremendous service to Krishna. But I was thinking like my father, who's just flattering me to get me to do something, you see. Prabhupada knows our potential, you know. If we just follow everything he says, that's what I'm understanding. If we just chant and really try to hear, then automatically you become detached, you see. We get rid of this ego, and this is what's holding us back, that I'm the doer. That if you do these things, then Krishna does everything. And then it becomes very ecstatic, very enlivening, because we don't have to worry about the results. Oh, I cannot do this because we're doing it for some recognition or some ulterior motive to be, you know, we're thinking like that, you know, for position, whatever. So that's really freedom. And Prabhupada said that, but we couldn't really grasp it. We were attracted to Prabhupada's energy, his love, and that. The philosophy was difficult for some of us. Although Prabhupada did say one time to Upendra, Upendra had come back to Hawaii. I think Prabhupada was sending him to Fiji then to open up a temple. Upendra is one of the early God brothers from the early days. Just a wonderful devotee, so warm and kind and affectionate. So many devotees felt that way. And he was a young man, and Prabhupada took him under his wing in the beginning. And so he went back to LA with Prabhupada from Hawaii, and when Upendra came back, he said he was with Prabhupada in his room, and they were sitting together in a very intimate way. And Prabhupada just looked at him and said, you know, Upendra, those were the good old days. He said, they will not be like that anymore. Yeah. So I certainly I would not exchange that experience. Everything has its purpose. Jai Anilo Premadana Karuna Prachu